Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Futurebuild live webinar with myself, Marie Grieve. I'm the managing director of the marketing company Costello Palmer Communications, and I'm also the curator for the content program for the Digital Impact Stage at Futurebuild. And today's webinar is the sustainable actions we need to take to build a better world. This has come about as a follow-on from the live event that took place on the 2nd, 3rd and 4th of March. And what I'd like to do is have a little bit of an overview of how things went at the Digital Impact Stage, and we're also going to look at some of the key topics that came out of the talks. We've got some amazing speakers lined up for you today, all of which were part of the Digital Impact Programme. And first of all, I'd like to introduce John Adams, who is the head of product for Glider, and John's going to be running our session today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump off in just a minute and let John take over, but just a little bit of housekeeping to say, first of all, let us know where in the world you are. Drop in the chat where you are, whether you're in London, whether you're in Lisbon, whether you're in LA, as I am today. John's actually in London. Some of our speakers are based all across the UK. We just want to hear about where you are. Also, if you have any questions, please pop them in the question box. We'll look at them at the end of the event. And equally, if you have any comments as our speakers talk today, please just drop them in the chat and we'll get to you as much as we can. Okay, John, have a great talk and speak to you soon.
Thank you very much, Marie. Welcome to our webinar today. Glider sponsored the Digital Impact Stage at Futurebuild 2022, and it was a really fascinating stage to look after for 3 days. And we had some great speakers, and there was really a feeling that we'd moved beyond how to adopt digital, how to do BIM, do robotics have a place in the industry. All of the things we were talking about a couple of years ago, they seem to have been moved into the not the done column, but very much into that we think we can achieve these things. We understand them enough to go on a journey and deliver them. So this time around, a lot of the content was around how do we create benefit with this? How do we actually create a better built environment and a better society based around this digital adoption of our built environment? So we had some fantastic speakers, some really, really insightful discussions, and there was a key theme. Sustainability just kept coming up across a lot of the different talks, whether that was about materials or processes or technologies or behaviors. It was a rich theme right the way across the event. So we decided to bring everyone back together and get some of those outstanding speakers from the live event and bring them together to discuss our digital adoption, but with that lens on sustainable actions that we can take to really improve the impact that we all have. So I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to start asking some questions, and we'll just have a bit of a backwards and forwards in the conversation, and I hope everybody enjoys the session. So our first speaker is Esther Galaski, and Esther is the team leader of sustainability and carbon consultants at Mock McDonald, and she also is the team leader for the European Climate Resilience Consultancy team and Emerging Circular Economy Initiative. So there's some fantastic threads under Esther's guidance over at Mock McDonald. And she's got a really interesting background as a chartered engineer and fellow of the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers, as well as being trained as an organic and analytic chemist. So welcome to the stage, Esther.
Thanks very much, John. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ashley Murray, who is the digital program lead at McLaren, and Ashley has over 15 years of experience in the industry and is leading the digital strategy at McLaren Group, and is an active member of the UK BIM Alliance executive team. And she brings a really great blend of real world technical experience and enthusiasm for digital change. So welcome to the stage, Ashley.
Thank you, John. Happy to be here.
Great. Next up is Vicky Reynolds, who's CTO at i3PT. And in that role, she's bringing together all of the experience that she has from working on lots of large national, international projects, and really brings a broad knowledge of the data scene in the UK and globally. And she's also an active member of the digital construction community and the UK BIM Alliance as well. So welcome to the stage, Vicky.
Thank you, John. Glad to be here.
And our final speaker today is Ben Malin, who is founder of Malin Design, who were actually shortlisted for BD Young Architect of the Year in 2019. And Ben and the team have a real passion for architecture, interior design, and urban design to really bring what we're talking about today into life in their design. So Ben, welcome to the stage. And you're on mute, Ben, but we
did you get the gist? I said thanks.
There we are. So what we're going to do, we've got some questions. I'm going to throw the first one out to the panel. If nobody jumps in, I'm going to pick on someone, and then we've got some other questions, but we may or may not get to them. We'll see how the conversation goes, and we can see lots of people have joined the call. Welcome everybody. I hope you do enjoy this. So our first question is about what we're going to talk about broadly over the next hour. We're going to be discussing the sustainable actions we need to take to build a better world. And in recent years, we have witnessed some amazing developments when it comes to sustainability in construction. So what changes in our approach and how we design and build have you seen that are really making a positive impact, particularly with regard to growing populations?
I don't mind jumping in there, if that's
Great.
all right.
Go for it, Vicky.
Personally, I think the biggest impact has been changing legislation and new requirements, which have come, unfortunately, from very unfortunate circumstances. So we had the Grenfell disaster, which has driven the creation of the Building Safety Bill, and we have a relatively dire circumstance with our sustainability globally and climate change, and that has led to things like the EU taxonomy. But what that has done is shifted responsibility for the acknowledgement of change from a supply chain directly into the client's hands. So both of these pieces of legislation and mandate reference the client as the accountable person in these scenarios. And what that does is it enforces a show me, don't tell me kind of mentality. So it's not good enough to just report that you're being ever so green and doing ever so well with your building safety. You actually need the evidence to back that up now. And that's then pushing down the supply chain, and clients are becoming to be more mindful about the kind of contractors and subcontractors that they're procuring, how they procure them, and the digital skills of that supply chain as well, and the ability to not just report back to them in statements, but to report back to them in real evidence and real data. And I think legislation, although we shouldn't rely on it to enforce change, it really does get the ball rolling. So that's what I think has had the biggest impact.
Brilliant, thank you, Vicky. And before we jump into everybody else's ideas of what the biggest changes and the biggest positive changes have been, let's stick on legislation for a little while, because you all have a different lens on this, right? Whether it's McDonald, McLaren, or Malin Design, legislation impacts you in different ways. Are you seeing the positive impacts Vicky was speaking about? I'm going to hit you first, Ben.
Yeah, I can take that one. I mean, yes, to a degree. I mean, I think we need to do a lot more. I mean, there's positive moves in terms of legislation. It seems like every year there's a new update to Part L of the building regulations you need to satisfy in a building. I think we're still a bit sloppy in how we build, and there's often ways around holistically trying to achieve the goals in that respect. And we still have so we still fundamentally promote there's a tax system in this country which promotes new build construction, which is mad, really. I think that if we have a tax system that promotes demolishing a half decent building because it's a lot cheaper and a lot easier to build a new build because it's 0 VAT rated, is just a bit bonkers, really. So I think there's certain ways we need to still improve. But I think what's interesting at the moment, I feel like there's clearly an overall, across the population, there's much more awareness that this is now a real emergency. We need to do something about it. But what the positive impact of that we've seen is, I think we're in a time of unprecedented knowledge sharing So I was initially skeptical of things like the Architects Declare movement, because I thought, well, that doesn't really mean we're doing anything. We're all just saying we acknowledge there's an emergency. But actually, if you look at the documentation through the Architects Declare network, there's a huge amount of knowledge sharing, research into materials and how buildings can perform better, which actually takes some time and investment in everybody's individual projects. Not so long ago, people would have been holding that quite close to their chest because it's their own invested work. But actually, it's great that we, as a design community and a construction community, I think, are coming on board to this idea that we're only going to achieve this and we're only going to get through it if we all help each other. And I think that's hugely positive, and that's continuing to develop in a positive way.
So Ashley, are you seeing the same with the contractors and the others in your space? Are they starting to do this knowledge sharing around the standards?
Yeah, I think they're behind slightly. The design community has always been pretty collaborative, right? Generally, so we've sort of got an easy route into it. But I think, yeah, there is an acknowledgement there are benefits to achieve, and I think it's starting to become areas where there's economic benefits of doing things in a sustainable way, particularly when it comes, we might talk later about well-being and healthy spaces. But people are getting on board. There's a general acknowledgement that we have to do something, I think, and we've got to act fast.
Fantastic. Ashley, are you seeing the same? Legislation starting to help?
Yeah, I would agree. From a contractor's perspective, the tax break on red diesel, or the end of the tax break, is going to have a huge impact. But it's really pleasing to say we've already seen changes from our subcontractors. They're bringing in both new power sources and tools they can use to move away from those traditional methods, but also more green and reliable. And I think when we talk about carbon, everybody immediately thinks of the building we're designing, the finished product. The impact of construction, temporary works, pumping concrete, and all those activities we go through to build the building have a massive impact on our carbon footprint. So while there's still a lot more to do, there has been some developments from all lines of the supply chain. So I do think it's positive.
Fantastic. And Esther,
sorry,
go ahead.
We've got to be mindful as well, though. Sometimes it is better to pull a building down and rebuild. It depends on the carbon footprint of that building. So it's not just, remaining old is always better than building new. You have to take into account the evidence, which then pulls us back to that data and that analysis again. It's about making informed decisions. There's no tick box. This is better. This is worse kind of solution.
Yeah.
Great. So we'll come to you last on this one, Esther, around legislation. But when you finish making comments about legislation, can you tell us what you've witnessed that are the really positive changes that we're starting to see?
I'd like to sort of just focus on things like whole life carbon calculations, because I think that is making a difference in that. Now we moved from a few years ago on a qualitative X is Y, then X is better than Y kind of approach to something that is, it's more and more projects need to consider the quantitative or semi-quantitative ways of actually reasoning out which solution is better for you, because there isn't a solution that is going to work for every place all the time, much better, because then everything would be made of one type of material and that would be the magic thing, and it doesn't work like that. So because every building that we make is bespoke, there's no such thing as building on a manufacturing line, so you cannot standardize buildings. I know you can standardize parts of buildings, but basically the carbon argument has to be done on individual projects for the individual calculations. And the fact that that's now becoming more of the norm, it's still quite sort of a differentiating thing for projects. So it's not done consistently across the board, but it's the fact that it's being done. You can actually start demonstrating this. So it also limits the opportunity for greenwash, obviously, but more importantly, it actually starts to inform people, educate people, and actually give them some sort of some way to tell, that sort of thing that Vicky mentioned about whether it's the right thing to tear down the building or not to tear down the building. And there's an objective from a carbon perspective, there's an objective proof of that. So rather than just, up till recently, we all knew that generally it was better to keep a building, but because it's not something that you can put into a business case, that's a quantitative sort of thing. It was something that I think it was just a sort of too difficult pile, really. And I think that's now changing a lot.
Fantastic. I think we've opened a massive can of worms. I mean, we could talk about whether you should keep buildings or not for the next hour. But I will try and move us on a little bit. One of the things I think is a really positive change of the last few years, sensors. The fact that we can start getting data to see whether the designs that we created and the buildings that we put on the ground are doing what they were intended to do, but also are people using it the way they said they were going to use it? Do we need to change? Do we need to reflect on that? And that's led to a term called sustainable architecture. And it gets pushed out there quite often, sustainable architecture. But what does it actually mean? So I'm going to put that one to you, Ben, first, around what is sustainable architecture?
Well, we could easily talk about this for hours as well, couldn't we, and debate what it actually means. I mean, I think for me personally, it's about architecture and urban design with some longevity. Now, that's not to say that everything we design and build in terms of buildings and cities should stay in the same state they're in when we design them. We need to factor in an element of adaptability as our society changes. But I think in terms of, if I answer that in two areas, one on a building scale, and then also on an urban scale. I think in a building scale, sustainability, there was a time when a sustainable architecture was green facades and timber cladding and, solar PV on the roof, almost in a stylistic reference point. But actually, sustainability, I think, is about building well. It's about building in a robust way. And I think the movement to use much more modern methods of off-site construction are helping that, building things with reduced waste, and considering details that we can actually build well, we can make airtight, we can produce a quality building that's going to stand the test of time. Because the idea that you build a building that has a planted facades, timber cladding, PV on the roof, but it only lasts a few years and you have to start the whole process again, is not sustainable in any way whatsoever. So I think the interesting discussion around sustainable architecture for me is how we're moving modern methods of fabrication to inform that design process. If you look at some of the work, the really fantastic work that Webb Yates and group work and Amin Taha did on load-bearing stone to their Sterling Prize shortlisted Clerkenwell Close building, they showed that things like load-bearing stone combined with CLT or timber flooring and framework could be actually, extremely sustainable. And it might not be a form of architectural design that you thought 10 years ago would be really pushing the sustainable design agenda. So I think it's really interesting how we're evolving or using methods of construction which are a lot smarter in how we build. Again, we need to get a lot better at that, particularly in this country. Countries like Canada are doing it way more intelligently and much more on a scale better than we are. But I think that building well and designing using really intelligent digital systems, which we have, the use of BIM modeling and integration of structure and services into the design process early before you produce any waste, is what it should be about. And in terms on an urban scale, I think it's a really interesting moment for us now because we're addressing this climate emergency, but also we're starting to address the results of the global pandemic and what our cities should look like and feel like, and how we improve the well-being of our cities. So how do we increase biodiversity and create greater places for people to live? And that's just, for me, that's sort of common sense, really, that if we create great places that people want to use and are owned by the communities and the users that benefit from them, they're going to last longer. And the elements which are supporting that are, I think, starting to come into urban design a lot more. And it's about integrating of natural spaces, about green spaces, and about biodiversity. Canada, as I mentioned Canada earlier, Toronto, the first city in the world that have passed a law that you have to build green roofs on developments over a certain size. Now, green roofs aren't going to save the planet, but it's just one of those moves in legislation, for example, where I think we could get even better at not only responding to the climate emergency, but a result of responding to the climate emergency, we start to do something about our well-being in urban spaces.
Great, thanks, Ben. I'm going to pick up on one of the points that you made earlier, that some of the not considered sustainable architectural materials are starting to make some real headway. I saw a double vaulted concrete ceiling floor slab design this week on one of the universities, 75% less concrete, and no one will ever see it. Incredibly green, but it doesn't scream sustainable architecture because it's going to be hidden within a structure. So anybody else on the call got any thoughts on what sustainable architecture means to them? Because it's kind of a subjective term.
I think that's the thing. It is subjective, and I'm really looking forward to the day when it just becomes architecture. It's the same with digital. You know, when you have BIM projects, it almost does a disservice in some instances because it's seen as a different way of working rather than what should be the established norm. I would say, to bring back to things like sensors, I think the design stage is where you need to start thinking about what sensors you want for what, to make what decisions. And the fact is, it's probably more sensible and more green, sustainable to start small with something like that, because there's a common misconception that data is free, data transfer is free. If you censor everything and make a couple of good decisions, you're being greener. But actually, if all of that tech, all of those sensors, all of that data storage and transfer is using energy, then you're negating all of the great things that you're getting from the original decision. So you're trying to do good, but you're actually not helping yourself or the planet at all. So I would say, to go back to that, everyone thinks that, right, I'm going to put sensors in my building, therefore I have to sensor everything. I have to get all the data all the time at real time, and then find out what decisions I can make from that. No, it has to be the other way around to be sustainable. Think about what your really good wins are. What do you need to know? Figure out how to learn that. And then if in 2 years' time, 6 months' time, whatever, when the building's in operation, you go, you know what, actually, if we could get this information from the building as well to complement that data that we already have, we will learn X amount more. So therefore we'll invest this amount more in bolting on or building up that tech or that tech stack. So I would say technology and digital can be touted sometimes as the silver bullet solution to sustainability, but just be mindful that it's not always a sustainable option if it's not done in an efficient way.
So sustainable architecture so far is well constructed, designed for construction, longevity with just the right amount of technology. Because anybody who's spent any time looking at data centers knows that we're dropping data centers into the sea because they create so much heat, it's very hard to cool them. So if you're creating lots of data, there is a knock-on effect of that data. Are you getting benefit? So have we got anything to add to our slowly emerging definition of sustainable architecture, Ashley or Esther?
Not so much on the data, but I would go back to your comment about your concrete vault. Can we ever consider concrete sustainable based on the impact it has on its carbon footprint, as well as the methods we use to build with it? My personal view, and it's certainly not an area of expertise, is I don't see how we can consider concrete sustainable.
I think there's certainly a raging debate around the type of concretes we currently have the types of concretes we could move to. There's a team out in California, I believe, who are growing concrete and it's being formed in sunlight. So aggregates brought together and formed in sunlight. There's new concretes emerging, but procurement to get them onto site, I haven't seen any project that's shaped to take this type of technology yet. So we've still got a bridge to get us between these emerging replacements for materials and where we want to use them. Right now, if someone's putting a floor in, it's going to be steel or it's going to be concrete. So if we can save 75% of that concrete in the short term, it's better. But you're right, it's not perfect. We need to keep moving beyond that. So we can add that really carbon considerate approach to materials, even if it's going to be there for a lot of years. Should we use it in the first place? It's all part of our sustainable architecture. Esther, have we got any thoughts to add to sustainable architecture?
Yeah, I think another key aspect of it is designing for flexibility, because a lot of times the criticism you have about why you need to tear down a building is because it doesn't suit the requirements of of the more modern days, whether it's ceiling heights or whether it's servicing or whatever that is. And I think that's the key to it. And flexibility by definition is a bit of a subjective term. And I think that's why I've seen few examples where it's properly done in terms of, because what's the metric behind flexibility? But if in good examples of that, you can see that when you have, especially say in office buildings, where you have an adaptability designed into that to make sure that things can be moved around as people might, or teams might change, and meeting rooms might become phone booths or whatever that is. That's important to look at, see where the trends are going, and that's not something that necessarily, as somebody who's usually part of the design team, it's not something that we regularly scan the horizons for to see how people's expectations change, because we very rarely have that kind of direct contact with the users of the building, which is itself is worth a discussion why that is. But it's and I would say architects are, I would say, similarly distanced, maybe a bit less than we are engineers, but I can't say that too many architects that have direct access to the users of the buildings later on to say, okay, well, does this actually suit your requirements? So I think having more information, examples, frameworks on how to design flexible buildings, I think is what would make them more sustainable really in the long term. And that's kind of where circularity comes into it. Say, how much of the building can you actually reuse, and how can you design something that you can reuse as much of it as possible? And you have a sort of a concept of the building really, where the basics of the building, the stuff that's not the scatter cushions and all that, the good stuff in there that fills the building, but the basics of it can stay for 100 years or more.
Fantastic. So I think we've half defined sustainable architecture. So any students on the call looking for a thesis, we've just given you a heading, so you can get started on that. But we'll move on now. So assuming we've just created a piece of smart architecture, or we're in the process of creating one, Esther, how do we ensure that the environment in there is a healthy environment for the people who occupy the building?
Yeah, well, healthy buildings as a concept is, of course, that encompasses a lot of things. So that's daylight, that is internal air quality, that is ergonomics even. So, there's so many disciplines that contribute to this. And so to say, my lens on healthy buildings is a particular one, and I'm aware that means there is more subjectivity to the topic that appears to be, say, from the internal air quality lens. I get involved in that a lot because that's kind of my specialism. But from an architectural point of view, for example, there's a lot that can be done to make buildings healthier, and that's also when we mean by healthy buildings. Do we mean physical health? Do we mean mental health, etc.? And I think this is where both really come in, because you can see that the examples and the proof of views and daylight having on people's mental health, and thereby indirectly productivity. Obviously, the connection and the business case for healthy buildings is that ultimate productivity, quest for productivity. And I get this question a lot, if I change the lights, what's the productivity gain? And I'm like, nothing, absolutely nothing, because you need to think about this as a multi-attribute thing. So you cannot break it down to that level that if you tweak the system by this, you can predictably get that much gain out of it. Because what I say to people about healthy buildings is that the healthy buildings are about people. And although that sounds like a cliche, but actually what that means is that people are not robots, and they're not always act in a predictable and even logical way. So you can have the nicest building with the most daylight and the plants everywhere and free coffee on tap, but if your dog dies in the morning, you're not going to be productive, because we are not ultimately not fully rational fully rational creatures. So but in terms of where we can put some rational argument in there for, and metrics for healthy buildings, like I said, things like daylight and views are very important for that kind of mental aspect, as well as productivity. Where I specialize is things as ventilation and internal air quality, which is actually a lot less appreciated in terms of the impact on people's health, but it's actually very important. And recently there have been a few studies showing a direct correlation between people's cognitive functions and various air pollutants. So not just CO2, which is obviously what people usually focus on because it comes from metabolic sources, people breathing, but things like small particulate matter that often comes from the outside. So often in sort of heavily polluted urban areas, people's mental capabilities can decrease by 10-20% due to the outdoor air pollution, and that's been shown in several academic studies just lately. And interestingly, also in an equivalent way, there are also air pollutants that are being generated inside, which is also not always that well known. So some things like cleaning agents, copiers, those sorts of things generate actually air pollution internally. So the key to that, of course, is not just having good ventilation and increasing ventilation rates as much as possible, but also to minimize the generation of these, because then you have to filter out less. So, like I said, healthy buildings is a bit of a complicated concept, but individual bits of it can be reasonably well quantified where that's applicable and actually controlled.
Thanks very much. So lots of information there, and lots of good science emerging around how we make the spaces more healthy. Is this actually working its way towards what's getting built? Are we starting to see better ventilation, better daylighting strategies, or are we still waiting for that really to start hitting the construction realm?
It is starting to creep through. It goes back to what Vicky was saying earlier. The legislation, the Part L updates that come out later this year, are all going to generate increased demand and sort of accelerate things at that end. There's still a long way to go.
And Ben, is when you're sat with the pen, is ventilation starting to become an architectural concern, or do you still leave it to the engineers later on?
Well, you can't, unfortunately, because it's too late, because you'll ruin your design late on. I mean, getting the ventilation right, needs to start with the fabric first. Have you got the building situated in the right place? Are you working with the environment in terms of where the wind and air and light are coming from before you even get to developing down the design line? And then if you want to integrate MVHR or ventilation systems or various elements of the design that want to contribute on a servicing level, if you leave it too late, then you start to ruin the layout and the build-up of your building. So all these things are worth integrating very early and designing very early. I think in terms of ultimately it's a client or a funder of a project at whatever scale are going to make the ultimate decisions on these things. And I think the challenge is for certain clients trying to point out the benefits of implementing service design in this particular level in a particular way, because it's not as obvious as a marble countertop in a kitchen that someone can touch and get and they see an image of in a magazine, right? It's we refurbished a house where we implemented an MVHR system into an existing Victorian house, and whilst the client didn't initially see a benefit in those rooms where it was being used, when they went to the rooms where it wasn't implemented, it felt awful. It's kind of hard to get that feedback loop to get the air movement being an important part of the design to invest in. But I think ultimately that could be said about lots of things. I think the important bit where we can from an architectural design point of view, add our most value is starting and getting right principles first. So then the things that we need to work for us in a service point of view are having to work less hard because we're making the right moves from the very beginning in terms of orientation, the way the buildings put together, the shapes of spaces and size of spaces, etc.
Thanks, Ben. Vicky, you have a very broad position across the industry, and you speak to a lot of people, possibly even more than I do. Is healthy buildings becoming a topic that people are really starting to talk about, or is it still a little niche?
The smart ones are, especially those that are building corporate offices and things like that. I mean, now more than ever, in terms of business sustainability, you need to retain staff, and staff don't want to go back into offices right now. So how are you going to encourage them to do that? For that collaborative work and that that growth, we know, and it's been proven that you need people-on-people contact at least every now and again. Meetings are invaluable, and face-to-face chatting is something that you can't replicate over Zoom. And so if someone has got used to working from home, they like their house and they're sat there and they're comfortable and they can join webinars in their pajamas. I'm not in my pajamas, I promise. But if they can do all that kind of stuff, why do they want to go into the office? And what people are looking for now are offices that make them feel comfortable, almost like a replication of their home, where they can feel like they're looked after, they've got all the amenities they need, there's good daylight, good airflow. They have to be excited about going into these spaces, otherwise they'll look for a position somewhere where they are excited about going in. And so I think when we talk sustainability, you also have to think about social sustainability and business sustainability. So I get that is something that I'm seeing the more savvy clients think about now. It's how do I look after the people who will be residing in my building once it's built in a way that makes them become more loyal to me and want to come in more often.
Thanks, Vicky. I'm going to move the subject on from that point, actually, because if we're designing new typologies of buildings to make people want to come to them, smart technology is there. We were starting to see building operating systems. We're starting to see the emergence of smart cities. So, Ashley, how's that starting to manifest itself? What does the progress towards smart start to look like for you?
I think it goes back to what you mentioned earlier about data. And as Vicky pointed out, key data only, not absolutely everything. Ultimately, all that technology sensors is bringing us data about the building, about how it's performing, but it's also data about the people, the activities or the human behavior it's encouraging. And that is, for a smart building, hopefully it's able to react and adapt or even interact, so that it becomes a pleasant place, a safe place to be in, and people want to be there. Even though for the wider things that Ben talked on, that data we can learn from the past, and it can all be used again to inform the design of the next phase of buildings. So I think in the long run, it is helping us become more sustainable.
Fantastic. So smart tech starting to create its own feedback loop into the design process. So how, Ben and Esther, how do we bring the technology into the work that you guys would do together? If you were working on a project together, you're trying to get something delivered, where does that smart data feedback loop feed into your process?
Shall I go first?
Sure, go ahead. Yep.
I mean, I'm not a specialist on this. Is not my area of specialism, certainly. But I think that an observation to contribute is that for a long time, the problem with building, the problem with architecture is it takes so long actually to go through, and it's why things like, if you look at the RIBA climate challenge documentation, if we need to be achieving certain things by 2030, 2050 and beyond, they're things that are on the drawing board now, So we really need to act quickly. How data is helping, and the reason why I say that is that there has been gathering data in various areas of our field of work over the last decade, which is starting to inform decisions that we're making on a basic level or design level now. So I'm not talking about if, you know, the specifics of science in one particular area that we implement to a specific thing, but the areas of our work that we're discussing here and the open source knowledge in things like Architects Declare documentation I mentioned in the beginning, that information takes time to produce and analyze and record, and we're getting that information that's starting to inform how we're doing things, starting to inform what materials we choose, starting to inform what materials work better together, etc. But that's, you know, that's the area of the industry that I see and that we're involved in, is that feedback loop is getting faster and faster and faster, and hopefully, you know, the data we're learning about how our buildings are built and how we're producing them and the effects of living in them, whilst the sort of data assessment technology is getting smarter, that hopefully that feedback loop starts to get a bit shorter and quicker so we can respond.
I was going to just kind of add to that in the last few years, you've seen the technology become more robust. So we've gone through, and we're probably still in the stage of that to some extent, where there's just everybody sells sensors or everybody sells technology. But the question is how, you know, I mean, when I ask these questions, like how long does your stuff last? Does it need calibrating? What is your error margin in the data? Because there's one thing that you get data, but how good is this data? Are we, you know, because none of us are experts in a sort of, you know, we don't have PhDs in this kind of topic normally. That the people who have the PhDs in this topic work in academic institutions, not on building projects. So we don't necessarily have the skill set, or, you know, even collectively in a design and construction team, we don't have the skill set to scrutinize that data for robustness. So I think that I've seen at least a number of years where there was a lot of stuff and a lot of sensors out there, and you can see how probably every 6 months I can see an improvement in these, which is great. And I hope that we get to the point where there's going to be, you know, you no longer have to question the data that comes out of these sensors, but you can start focusing on what to do with the data. And as Vicky was saying, choosing which data streams are more important to you than others, because yeah, it's I think we got, at least to sort of what I've seen, and even more recently, is that there's just a lot of focus is on getting the data, not so much on focus on the quality of the data, and not so much focus on what are we using it for. So we're kind of at the, at least from what I can see, and I'm perfectly happy to be proven wrong on this, but we're still in the beginnings of this whole thing. So it's not part of the normal process on, you know, the way that you, for example, have, you know, maybe BMS systems or whatever they are in a building. It's not that kind of intuitive process that is in the design and construction systems to actually to incorporate this level of digital information and use it in a way to learn how the building works.
Fantastic. Thanks, Esther. I think so. We're starting to see a new typology emerging: faster feedback loops, better technologies, more insights. Vicky, who's going to benefit, and what do those benefits start to look like?
I think, first of all, before I answer that, I just want to make a point about tech and digital, and even digital information management not being interchangeable. So we often bundle technology and digital into the same sentence, which can be really off-putting. Because when you start to, I know I made a career on being a tech skeptic. I am terrible with technology and computers. The only reason I've got to know more about it is because I kept asking why and kept questioning. So I don't feel like we need that, and what's that for? And you don't necessarily, if we look at smart cities as an example, and the panel that we had at Futurebuild, which John, you were a part of, one of the main focuses there was the fact that you can over tech and under process, and that is massively detrimental. And so you don't have to jump into technology with both feet to start collecting data and making better decisions. Make it really simple to begin with. Just do better than you were doing before. Find good information management processes. Pull in the data that you need to pull, analyze that, make better decisions. use very simple tech initially to do that, and then build up to the bigger, sexier technology. Get so many people contacting me saying, can you tell me about a digital twin, please? And you're like, you know what, you haven't even got your feet under the table with BIM yet. I've seen the way you manage information, and it's terrifying. I don't want to start talking to you about digital twins, because it's just a distraction. What you're doing is distracting yourself from actually putting in a little bit of hard work and improving your base processes. There's no silver bullet in technology. And I've gone completely off topic and down a rabbit hole, John. I'm so sorry. I'm going to come back now and answer the question that you actually asked me, which was around the benefits, right?
It was indeed, but we love a rabbit hole. It's all good.
I'm back up to the top of the rabbit hole now. I mean, ultimately, the benefits are for everyone, right? If we're designing better, then it's easier to build. It's better to build. Clients have better understanding at an earlier stage of what their final output might be, and they can make better decisions around that. It's a nicer building to operate because you've got more information and things happen more efficiently. Ultimately, it's a nicer building to live in for the people living in it. But more importantly than that is, if we're being more efficient and sustainable throughout all those processes, we're having a better impact on the environment. If we're targeting net zero or zero carbon, reducing our carbon, making things more sustainable, biophilic design, or sustainable design, all these good things that we're now considering doing, it all has massive impact for the environment. So whether you're in construction or not, whether you use that specific building or not, you will see the benefits, whether you directly appreciate that yourself or not. It's better for everybody on the planet.
Fantastic. We're pushing on the clock a bit now, and we've got some fantastic questions coming through. So I'm going to ask my final question, but if you can keep your answer as snappy as you can, we'll move on to the questions. And it's quite a simple, well, not a simple question, but quite a short question. Where to next? Where do we need to take the construction industry to address the climate emergency? So short and punchy, if you can. And I'm going to start with Esther.
Sorry, would you mind just repeating that? I had a bit of an audio issue. So,
no problem.
At the end about climate change.
Yes, so a very quick answer on where we go to next. So what is the next action we need to take to address the climate emergency?
From where I stand, of course, there's lots of good answers for this, but I'm going to focus on really where I think I can make a difference, or designers and construction industry professionals can make a difference, and really that is spend time at the early stages, which is something we've said about sustainability, which is something that came out. The AIA, the American Institute of Architects, came out with their integrated design project delivery process, something like 15 years ago, and that's still not done. It's not, and it's not just them. It's REBA, and there's a lot of organizations that still talk about this. That really, the time you invest in considering the design carefully is more than worth it, because the changes that you need to make later in the design are much more costly. And it's that kind of, it's called the McLeamy curve, that shows you this kind of what is the cost of changes later on in the design and construction process, and they're large costs associated with changes. So, but it's very difficult to make the business case to project managers and people who plan out the projects to spend more time, longer time during the design, longer time considering different options and different measures, because it's not something that is generally, well, it's not done as a routine basis, because kind of a lot of the design is already perceived to be constrained, and when you actually dig into it a little bit, it turns out it's more of a perception, not because people are too afraid to almost question the status quo. And I'm hoping that really some of this legislation and some of the other drivers, so policy drivers or benchmarking or whatever it may be, so something that's not necessarily need to be even legislative, but something that drives the market to some extent, will actually entice people to try to challenge the status quo. The number of times you hear that climate change 2050, 2040, 2030, whatever the deadline is not going to happen without a major shift in thinking. And I think that's that is spot on. It's not just true for us design and construction professionals, but elsewhere as well. I think Ben was talking about tax regimes and all sorts of things. So it depends a lot more than just on us, but I think we have talked about this for a long enough time to really start seeing a difference in how designs are considered and how long they are actually considered.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm gonna throw the ball to you next, Vicky.
Yep, cool. Change procurement and the way we manage contracts to focus more on collaboration and less on competition. I think information needs to be shared better and decisions need to be made together for the good of the project and the environment rather than individuals' pockets. And I think that will have the biggest impact on the environment.
Fantastic. Ben?
I would say embrace the opportunity. Declaring a climate emergency has been a great call to arms to skeptics who might have been out there of how much we need to achieve in how little time. But I'm an optimist, and I think this is a great moment in which we as a design and construction and technology industry can really make an impact. Back end of the 1800s, it was civil engineers who really saved us from cholera, because they started to understand that it was contaminated drinking water that was causing the problem, not an airborne disease. And there was a sewage system that was designed in central London, which is still supporting a lot of the city today. So I think through emergencies and through real challenging times, we can really move forward in terms of our implementation of design and technology. And I think given that there's so much involvement in discussions like this and open source material, I think it's a great moment for us to really leap forward in our level of quality of design and construction.
Fantastic, thanks, Ben. And Ashley, final thoughts before we have questions?
I would echo the sentiment of what everyone else has said and say that we need to be bold. Now is the time. From a contractor's point of view, it's very easy to push everything onto the client and wait for them to ask. But I think we can take leadership in this and refuse a project if it isn't in line with our values or benefiting the wider community.
Fantastic. I think that's been a really positive discussion, and we've got some great questions coming through. And I think this one's going to go to you first, Ashley, because it harks back to what we were talking around concrete earlier. So this one's from Paolo Costa. Thank you, Paolo. Do you think that a real net zero construction is ever possible, or will this only be achieved with financial carbon offsets?
Right now, I think offsets are the best way, or the most convenient, certainly, and viable way forward. I would like to think we can get there one day. We've just got a lot of work and investment and research to do to get us there.
Fantastic. I agree.
Very optimistic.
I share your optimism. I think we need to change almost every element of what we do, but over time. And just we will get there. But it's a net zero building without offsets in the next 2, 3, 4 years. No, let's be sensible. Anybody else on net zero?
Yeah, I think it's a stretch target, isn't it? And you've got to have them. It's like, if someone, any business leader, if you target 20% growth in the next 5 years, you'll get 20% growth. But if you target 80 to 100% growth, you might get 30% growth. And so we have to look bigger and further and say, this is our ideal state, and that will push us to get better faster. I think we can't just sit on our laurels and say, yeah, but this is easier, so we'll do this.
Yeah, I just like to add to that. I think that it's and again, it's a similar point that I made about sensors, is that we're in a stage with net zero where it's a not very tightly defined concept. So I think what's needed is to define very strictly what net zero means, because too many projects and too many entities look at it as just a sort of offsetting PR exercise still, in a way that, again, earlier with sustainability, when it was energy reduction imperatives, and it was a similar sort of thing. So I think clearer definitions around this globally, not just in the UK, but globally, would be actually quite helpful, because then you could compare like for like, and there are a few projects out there that are either near zero or very close to it. They tend to be very, very small, specific type of buildings, but they do exist around. Not many of them, maybe half a dozen around the world, as far as I know. But it's important to make sure that we celebrate those ones that are measurably delivering that sort of thing, rather than the PR exercise, which at the moment is a bit difficult to differentiate.
We have to believe we're going to get there. I mean, it's and for me, offsets are kind of like running towards the finishing line of a race, but continually pushing the finishing line further. We need to get better actually achieving what we're setting out to achieve, and I think we can get there. If someone said to you 10, 15 years ago, can you 3D print a house? You would probably say, what's 3D printing? That's mad. But we take it for granted that actually that's not really super advanced technology right now. So we've got to echo Vicky's comment. You've got to aim really, really high in order to achieve what we need to achieve. But we've got to believe we can get there. And it's, you know, there's technology that exists that we're not implementing as well as we could do. And if we start to do that, we'll be a lot closer.
Fantastic. I think I've got two questions that I'm looking at, and I'm trying to decide between the two. I'm going to go for this one first, because I think it's going to take a little bit longer to answer. From Mark Hensby. Thanks, Mark. With flexible working, do we really need cities anymore? Can we live and work in smaller settlements, negating commuting altogether? Fantastic question. Who wants to have a stab at, do we need cities anymore? Do we want cities anymore?
I think they're two different questions. Do we need them and do we want them? But I think, no, we don't need them. But psychologically, we probably do still want them, and will want them for a long time. People want to, you know, there's a reason that Oxford Street, even though it's horrific to go to, is packed every single day of the week in London. And it's because it has everything there within a 10-minute walk. You've got all the restaurants you can imagine, all the shops you can imagine, some incredible businesses. And if people didn't want to go into that kind of area, you can find all of those things spread around London as well, elsewhere, and in small towns and cities. But people make the choice to go into central London. And so I think there's something psychological that we're still clinging on to that. Now, I think there will probably still be hubs with collaborative environments. I think the nature of how we see an office work might change quite drastically in the next 5 to 10 years. I don't think we're just going to see streams and streams of desks like we're used to, and lots of hot desking. I think we're going to see bigger meeting rooms, areas for collaboration, a lot more technology for hybrid meetings, and all that kind of good stuff. I think where we used to see one business in a 20-story building, we might see 3 businesses that are still the same size as that one that took the 20-story building, but they're sharing it, and just fewer people are coming in every day. But I don't think we're anytime soon going to see human beings move away from wanting cities.
And I would say, if I can add to that, why would we want to? I mean, it's absolutely right. Your point about do we need to and do we want to? There's huge benefits from agglomeration of activities and densification of populations. There's downsides as well. What we need to do is figure out how we design those cities better and learn from the benefits of a good city space. A good, intelligently dense city design is way more sustainable than spreading out all those people across the rest of the country and using up land that doesn't necessarily need to be used. So I think we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater when we look at urban or non-urban developments. I mean, there's a huge benefit of cities, and they can be fantastic places to be and to live and to work in. We just need to try, and I think we are starting to do this. We're starting to understand how those city spaces can be better, both from an ecological perspective, but from a well-being perspective.
Yeah, fully agree with both points made there. Cities are ingrained into what we are as people. It's a human thing to build a city. And when we go back and we look back through history, and we go back to Vitruvius and how to put a city in a space, you pick a hill, you pick one near a river, you can get utilities, you can get food, you can get transport, you can put your temple at the highest point. Obviously that's a football stadium these days, but we are still the same animal that want to enjoy a city. I think the idea that cities will go away, I don't believe they're going to go away, but will they become more entertaining, cleaner, more enjoyable? I really do hope so, because I live up in the frozen north, and when I travel down to London, I enjoy London for a day. I don't mind it for 2. Come day 3, I've had enough London. I'm on my way back out, and I'm glad to be heading north. So yeah, it's not too late for cities, but can we improve them? Certainly we can. Esther and Ashley, any thoughts on cities? Do we need them? Do we want them? Absolutely
I
fine.
back that, yes, personally. I was pleased to get back into a city.
Great. Okay, we have 1 minute left. So Esther, cities.
Cities. Okay, 1 minute. Very quickly. Yes, definitely. I think there's efficiencies to be made in cities, and you can see that time and again in terms of social indicators and poverty indicators. Yes, definitely. Coming from Eastern European country where forced urbanization was a thing in the 1980s, there are sensible limits to that, of course, because you can see that around the world that there's also unintended, rather poor consequences to urbanization where it's not needed. So I think this is where history needs to be there to form people's actions for the future, and people need to learn from that kind of history. But yes, definitely, cities have a good place.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. That has been a great discussion. I'm going to welcome Mary Grieve back to the stage now to close out the session. But thank you very much from me.
Thank you, John. That was amazing. I've been listening in really intently. I just love these do at Costello, and it's fascinating to hear everybody's opinions. And I always love to hear Esther talk about healthy buildings and healthy environments and what we can do. And Esther, I love the comment that people are not robots, and I completely agree. I think it's something we need to be thinking about. And as much as all this smart tech is leading the way for the future, we're still all humans at the end of the day. So everyone, thank you so much for taking part. John, thank you for sharing. Amazing as always. Thank you to our audience. I just want to say that this is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording once we're finished. We're also going to redirect you directly to the Futurebuild website for more information. So everyone, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.